Welcome to Civics and Coffee, a history podcast, the show all about United States history, delivered to you in the time it takes to enjoy your morning cup of coffee. I'm your host, Alicia, a historian trained in United States history with a passion for telling both the known and unknown parts of America's past. So grab your coffee and get ready for some bite-sized history. Hey everyone, welcome back. As is tradition around here, whenever I cover a president, I also try to make sure to dedicate an episode to their spouse, or to cover the woman, or sometimes women, who made their professional careers possible. I jumped into the Gilded Age by exploring the life and legacy of Rutherford B. Hayes, as his administration was a good marker for transitioning from Reconstruction to the Gilded Age. And like so many men before him, Hayes enjoyed the support and partnership of his wife of nearly 4 decades, Lucy Webb Hayes. Yet, like so many political wives, much of the First Lady's life and opinions remain under debate and speculation by historians. Adored by the press throughout her husband's career, Lucy Webb Hayes quietly broke ground for political wives and did so without attracting too much negative attention. But she wasn't exactly what everyone wanted her to be. So this week, I am diving into the life of Lucy Webb Hayes. In what ways did she represent a new generation? How did she pave the way for future First Ladies? And what exactly was her role in the temperance movement? Grab your cup of coffee, peeps. Let's do this. Lucy Webb was born on August 28, 1831, in Ohio. The youngest of 3 children, Lucy joined older brothers Joseph, born in 1827, and James, born in 1828. The patriarch of the family, Dr. James Webb, was a physician originally from Kentucky, who, despite his family's roots, was a strong supporter of the abolitionist movement. In fact, when Dr. Webb inherited a number of slaves, he traveled back to his home state and attempted to emancipate them, only to die in the cholera epidemic in the area. Thus, young Lucy and the rest of her family were forced to live without their father and main provider. I was unable to confirm how exactly Mrs. Webb cared for her young family in the aftermath of her husband's death, but in 1844, the family moved to Delaware and Lucy enrolled into the Ohio Wesleyan Preparatory Department, where she studied French, grammar, and penmanship. Without a father, young Lucy would become quite close with her grandfather Isaac Cook, and he would have a major influence on her life, including her decision to abstain from alcohol. In 1847, Lucy enrolled in the Cincinnati Wesleyan Female College, where she roomed with 400 fellow students. According to the National First Ladies biographies, Webb was considered a diligent student who received training in a variety of coursework, including geology, French, astronomy, and music. In 1850, Webb earned a college degree in liberal arts, making her the first First Lady to hold a college diploma. Webb first met her future husband at just 15 years old in Sulphur Springs, while Lucy was pursuing her studies in college, and Hayes was 24 and just beginning his legal career. Per historian Alida Black, the meeting may have been arranged, or at least blessed, by Mrs. Hayes, who knew about Lucy and thought she would make a good match for her son. In his eyes, Lucy was still too young, and thus the two parted ways only to reunite at some point in 1850, where they began a courtship and eventually married on December 30th, 1852, in the Webb family home in Cincinnati, Ohio. Lucy was a woman of many talents, including seamstress, and made her own wedding dress. Together, the couple had several children, 8 in total, with 5 living into adulthood. Their first, Burchard, came in 1853, followed by Webb in 1856, Rutherford in 1858, Joseph in 1861, George in 1864, Annie in 1867, Scott in 1871, and Manning in 1873. While focused on raising her family and supporting her husband, Lucy Webb Hayes was also firm in her support for the abolitionist cause and thus supported the nascent Republican Party. Hayes was apparently also a great admirer of John C. Fremont and his wife and hoped he would win the 1856 presidential election. When the Civil War erupted and her husband expressed his desire to enlist in the Army, Lucy supported his decision and made sure to visit her husband as often as was possible. She lent a hand when she could, using her sewing skills to mend uniforms, and made the rounds visiting sick and injured soldiers. The Civil War was a catastrophic, traumatizing event that touched all Americans, including the future First Lady, who wrote at the time, quote, "It is a hard thing to be a woman and witness so much and yet not do anything." End quote. Not only did Hayes visit soldiers in the camps, she also assisted with providing post-operative care and likely saw some pretty grotesque wounds, as this was still an era where surgery and surgical skill were under development. After becoming the First Lady of Ohio with her husband's election as governor, Lucy Hayes focused on supporting the welfare of the residents in her state. She helped establish an orphanage for children impacted by the Civil War, and despite initially working with private donors when the state legislature refused to allocate funding, Hayes eventually convinced the governing body to appropriate funds and assume control of the institution. When word spread that her husband was the chosen candidate for the 1876 presidential election, Mrs. Hayes was not initially on board, but, like a good political wife, kept these opinions to herself and focused on maintaining her composure while out in public, where she attended the Centennial Exhibition over the summer. Of course, as we know, her husband would prove victorious that fall, although he would come to the office under a cloud of suspicion, and the First Lady would have to contend with hearing her spouse and the father of her children being referred to as Ruther Fraud, a moniker I'm sure was grating. Nevertheless, Hayes took her role as First Lady seriously and believed it to be her responsibility to serve as a moral example for the country. Of course, given her education and her known abstinence from alcohol, several women's groups and organizations hoped that the incoming First Lady may be their champion, and she was approached by groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and women's rights leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton to be a leader in pushing their cause forward. There does appear to be at least some mild disagreement amongst historians as to whether Mrs. Hayes actually joined the Women's Christian Temperance Union. According to Alita Black, who worked with the White House Historical Association for several years in building a database containing biographical information about each First Lady and has authored several books about the First Ladies, Lucy Webb Hayes was approached several times but never chose to actually join the organization. Yet, the Miller Center, which is known for their scholarship about the presidency, has an article about the First Lady indicating that she was indeed a member of the WCTU. I will let you, dear listener, decide for yourself which you think is right. For what it's worth, my sense, given the material that I have access to, is that while Hayes was a supporter of the temperance movement and a woman who was a firm follower of the Methodist faith, I do not think the First Lady ever joined. Hayes was someone who preferred to do things quietly, and it does not appear that she was a devout supporter of the suffrage movement, which became a major platform of the WCTU cause. And when it came to Lucy Webb Hayes, I think many women throughout the country saw in her a woman who had access to the highest levels of power and who, in their mind, shared their beliefs. This was an attractive idea that I believe led many people to see and believe what they wanted. By the time the Hayes family prepared to enter the White House, Lucy's stance on alcohol was already well known, and thus temperance activists waited anxiously to see how she would handle entertaining at the White House. Given the circumstances of the election, there was no inaugural ball, and so the first time the First Family entertained guests was when they held a reception for the Grand Duke of Russia. Much to everyone's surprise, wine was served at dinner, as it always had. This decision, despite it being in line with standard protocol, drew a considerable amount of attention given the publicity surrounding Mrs. Hayes' stance on alcohol. For her part, the First Lady expressed discomfort with continuing to serve alcohol, and it was announced shortly thereafter that booze would no longer be served at the White House. Although the First Lady often shoulders the blame for the decision to ban alcohol from the White House, historical evidence suggests that the ultimate decision landed with her husband, or at the very least, that it was the result of a conversation between the couple. While Lucy was and had been a long and devout follower of the temperance cause, her husband had been fond of the occasional drink. But the president also saw the political value in courting temperance supporters for the Republican Party, and thus supported the decision to not serve alcohol at the executive mansion. Not that this decision was always fully respected. There is at least one story that claims one steward would find creative ways around the ban, such as making a special concoction called Roman punch that was served without disclosing that there was alcohol in it to the first family, or presenting it in frozen ice cubes that was served with fruit as dessert. Their decision to omit alcohol did not go over well in D.C. social circles, but the press, who seemed to have an affinity for the First Lady, did not harp on the decision too much, with one writing of the First Lady, quote, "a woman of infinite excellence of character, if a trifle fanatical on the subject of temperance," end quote. Temperance supporters celebrated the decision, and all credit and derision went to the First Lady. Several women began hosting Lucy Hayes tea parties in her honor. Frances Willard, head of the WCTU, said of the First Lady's choice, quote, "by the example of such leaders, temperance will become the fashion," end quote. Thus, they were all shocked when, upon attending an event outside the White House in 1878 where alcohol was served, the First Lady failed to make a complaint or demand the drink be removed from the table. Demonstrating her nuanced approach to temperance, the First Lady said, quote, "it is a great mistake to suppose I desire to dictate my views to others in this matter of the use of wine and such drinks. I do not use them myself or in my family, but I have no thought of shunning those who would think that I should want to be so dictatorial. I want people to enjoy themselves in the manner that is most pleasing to them." End quote. Some local temperance societies were appalled by the First Lady's response, calling Mrs. Hayes a fraud, while others defended her, claiming the First Lady had long since demonstrated her personal commitment to temperance. And while other presidential spouses may have incurred a deep, prolonged wrath as a result of such a perceived misstep, Mrs. Hayes seemed to rebound fairly quickly, and the matter was dropped almost as soon as it arrived. When not fending off demands to champion a bevy of causes, the First Lady focused her attention on improving conditions at the White House. Not only was it in need of some repair thanks to the constant foot traffic, but with the advancements in technology, the house also needed a few minor upgrades. Hayes updated the mansion by replacing the old copper bathtubs with new ones that featured running water, and installed the first telephone. She also fought for appropriations from Congress to help repair and refurnish the house, which suffered from frayed carpets and drapes. When Congress dragged its feet, Hayes got creative and used her homemaking skills to make the home look refreshed without spending money. She repositioned furniture to cover holes in the carpet and flipped drapes upside down to hide frayed edges. The couple also celebrated their silver anniversary while in the White House, and they marked the occasion by renewing their vows. And the bride was able to don her wedding gown once more, taking it out just a little after giving birth to 8 children. During her tenure as First Lady, Lucy Hayes worked to return the White House to the people. She was not a big fan of state dinners and drew a bit of controversy on her selected china pattern. The design for the china was a celebration of America's flora and fauna, and was apparently too realistic for some diners who felt the painted scenes on the plates were simply too graphic to be appropriate as formal china that would normally be served during a state dinner. I've seen some of the designs, and they are definitely more art pieces than your standard dinnerware, but to each their own, I guess. They did live beyond the Hayes administration, as both Jackie Kennedy and Richard Nixon used the soup plates as ashtrays, and President Gerald Ford apparently adored the china so much that he used them when serving congressional breakfasts. The first family is also responsible for hosting the first black musician when, in 1878, Marie Salika Williams, also known as Madame Salika, performed at the White House. In retirement, the Hayes family traveled the country before settling into their estate, Spiegel Grove, in Fremont, Ohio. Mrs. Hayes focused her energy on mental health for veterans and supported efforts to help veterans gain access to their pensions, as well as helping orphans impacted by the war. She also took on a leadership role in the Women's Home Missionary Society, serving as its president. The organization's goal was to improve the life of the poor and to educate women, particularly Black, Indigenous, and poor women from the South, on how to raise a family. In an 1887 speech for the organization, Hayes referred to immigrants from Eastern Europe as coming from quote-unquote heathen nations who did not respect women, and that it would prove incredibly more difficult to assimilate them to American culture, highlighting that not even Hayes was above the burgeoning biological determinism that would later fuel the eugenics movement. It marked a rare moment when the First Lady was rightfully criticized. Just 2 years later, in 1889, at the age of 57, Lucy Webb Hayes suffered a stroke and passed away. Flags across the country were lowered to half-mast in her honor, and she preceded her husband in death by 3 years. The couple was buried together, and their remains were moved in 1915 to their estate at Spiegel Grove, where they remain today. Lucy Webb Hayes was a woman caught between generations. One generation stuck in the past, still clinging to the ideals of domesticity and the belief that women shouldn't sully themselves by getting involved in the complicated and dirty world of politics, and believe that women should only work outside of the home in the rarest of occasions, lest they risk losing their virtue. The generation that followed would challenge a lot of the status quo and would look more like the First Lady in a lot of ways. They would be more educated and civic-minded and would become what historians have called the quote-unquote new woman. And although First Lady Hayes likely may not have made this decision for herself if offered, these new women entered the workforce in much higher numbers than prior generations. In many ways, Lucy Webb Hayes helped pave the way for future generations of women to earn a college degree and still maintain an air of respectability. Her affable nature and her ability to endear herself to the press and ensure positive coverage undoubtedly helped other young women demonstrate to weary parents or caretakers that it was possible to seek an education, marry well, and have a fulfilling life. A woman who navigated the complex national politics of her era in a time when women were still trying to break through, Lucy Webb Hayes left her mark in subtle ways that left breadcrumbs for future First Ladies to follow. And before I sign off today, I want to give a shout out to longtime listener Darren. I hope you found some tidbits in here that would have made a great conversation piece with your dad. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next time. Thanks for sitting down with me as I explored this chapter of American history. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe and share with your friends. I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.